With that, again, my name is Benji Cohn with the Minnesota DNR Fish and Wildlife Outreach Section, and I'd like to welcome our three panelists today. We're going to be talking a little bit about muskies, muskie research and what they've been eating, and a little bit about muskie fishing. So I'm going to turn over to Kamden, and you can introduce everybody and take it away.
Great. Thanks, Benji. My name is Kamden Glade. I'm a fisheries specialist up here in the tower office. A lot of the stuff we'll be talking about today is part of a collaborative research project that I worked on with Brian Herwig during my master's degree at Bemidji State. And then we've also got Jim Wolters from the Fergus Falls office on to kind of help us learn about how we can use the research that Brian and I have been doing over the last 4 or so years to help us catch more muskies once the season opens up this weekend. So with that, let's jump right into a little bit of background about muskies and their biology. Muskies or muskellunge are native to Minnesota, both to the Rainy River and the Mississippi River drainages. They've also been stocked in a handful of lakes outside of those drainages as well. They are apex predators. Uh, However, there have been attempts to use muskies as kind of a predatory control on stunted panfish populations, and those have largely been unsuccessful. They tend to prefer prey that isn't quite as tall as like a bluegill or a crappie, something a little bit more cylindrical like a perch or a sucker or a cisco. Muskies also occur at low population densities in just about every system where they're present, and that's regardless of if they're there naturally and naturally reproducing on their own, or if they're stocked by state management agencies. There's also been multiple studies in Wisconsin and Minnesota looking at potential impacts of muskie stocking and management on other fish populations. And by and large, there's been no documented cases of negative effects on walleye or really any other sport fish populations. That said, there's still lots of questions surrounding muskie, especially in Minnesota lakes. A lot of this is due in part to their low sample or their low population densities, and they're actually really tricky to catch both with hook and line and for DNR biologists working with nets and electrofishing. They tend to be really strong swimmers, so they're able to avoid our electrofishing gear, and unless conditions are just about perfect in spring, they tend to avoid our nets really well as well. So that leads to just a lot of unanswered questions, more or less because biologists are unable to get their hands on enough fish to answer some of the questions. So with that in mind, we started a series of research projects in 2019, trying to look at or use multiple different approaches to better understand the role that muskies play in lake food webs in Minnesota. First approach, we directly examined what muskies and other predators eat in different lakes by collecting their stomach contents through a process called gastric lavage. I'll be talking about this in more detail in the next few slides. The second approach, we used stable isotopes to investigate food webs more broadly and how muskies fit into those food webs. Brian will cover that in more detail in the second portion. Then he's also going to be talking about the third portion of the research project, where we use bioenergetics to look at consumption of predator populations beyond just the individual and how muskie populations compare to walleye, northern pike, and largemouth bass populations in terms of what and how much those species are eating. For all three of these projects, we had a special focus on Cisco or Tulubi. We were especially interested in the role that Cisco might play in lake food webs. Cisco are related to trout, so they're dependent on cold, clean water with lots of oxygen throughout the water column. They're also sensitive to warming waters and invasive species, so many populations have been in decline in recent years. They're also important prey for predators like walleye and northern pike, as well as lake trout in a lot of lakes where they occur. Brian led some research a handful of years ago on Elk Lake and Itasca State Park using stable isotopes again, and they showed that Cisco accounted for about 50% of the muskie diets, and they were also important for large walleye and northern pike. So all that said, that kind of begs the question, can Cisco reduce diet overlap among predator species, and what happens if Cisco populations decline in the future? So to try to answer these questions, we collected diets in 12 lakes throughout the state. We looked at lakes with and without Cisco to investigate potential differences in diets relative to the presence of this prey species. We also looked at a handful of lakes with and without muskies in order to test for differences in diets of other predators related to muskie presence. So you can see on the map there, the black dots are lakes where muskies are present. Blue, there's no muskies. Bold text is lakes with Cisco, and regular text is the lakes without Cisco. Then on top of those 12 lakes, there were also, I think, 7 additional lakes in the red dots here where stable isotopes were collected to look at food webs. Stable isotopes were also collected in all of the diet lakes as well. So we had a really large data set of stable isotope lakes to look at these questions. So how do we look at what fish are eating? First, we have to capture the fish. As I mentioned, this can be a bit of a challenge. Predominantly, we used electrofishing. We did use a little bit of DNR standard survey netting as well, but I've got a quick little video here to show what the electrofishing process looks like. So those 2 big booms hanging off the front of the boat are connected to a generator, and that conducts electricity into the water. We drive around with spotlights and bright lights on the front of the boat looking for muskies in the shallow water. And when we see them, we maneuver the boat on top and turn the electricity on, which momentarily stuns the fish. But as you can see here, as soon as those fish are removed from the electrical field, they recover really well. And then we bring those fish on board, put them in a live well until we're ready to collect data on a good handful of fish that we have on board. So once we have enough fish on board, the goal is to collect the diets from live fish and then be able to release those fish. And in order to do that, we use a process called gastric lavage. Basically, what we're doing is using lake water to flush out any stomach contents that fish have eaten recently. So we have this hose connected to a bilge pump that hangs over the side of the boat, connected to a battery, and we're just pumping lake water into the fish's stomach. And anything that the fish has eaten recently is forced back out through their mouth by the pressure that builds up behind the prey items. This process is really valuable for us because it allows us to, like I mentioned, release fish alive, which is especially important for muskies as they naturally occur at low population densities. And it also gives us the most detailed look at what these fish are eating, both in terms of the prey species and the size of the prey. Once we have our diets collected, we take everything back to the lab, we identify the prey and measure them, and then we use those measurements to calculate diet importance. So before we get going too much farther, I want to talk about what makes prey items important. If you think about going through the drive-through with your family, getting some fast food, maybe on your way home from a fishing trip, you've got this menu, and this menu you can think of in terms of different prey that might be in a lake, and how do we determine what prey is most important? Well, the most important things tend to be those that are present both in numbers and are relatively large in size. So looking at this menu here, that would be something along the lines of a hamburger patty. In the lake systems where we've been doing research, that tends to be things like yellow perch, sunfish, and white suckers. Other things might be really important in terms of number, but less important in terms of size. So that would be akin to the French fries. Even if you go through the drive-through and you maybe don't order your own fries, as you're handing food back to the back seat, you're probably snagging a couple out of the bag. So pretty much everyone ends up eating at least a couple fries. This is something along the lines of minnows in the top right corner or the tray full of aquatic invertebrates in the bottom left. Finally, we have things that maybe don't look like they'd be important. They're pretty rare in terms of looking at the menu or looking at the available prey. That said, they're really important for the individuals that might consume them. So this would be either the chicken nuggets or the filet of fish on the menu picture here. This is something along the lines of like frogs or shrews or muskrats. We saw a few birds in our study. So these are things that, yeah, aren't necessarily important in terms of the whole population, but are certainly important to that one individual. I'm sure you all know maybe a younger family member that really loves their chicken nuggets. They get those wherever they go. They may not be important for your whole family, but if you try to tell that kid that chicken nuggets aren't an important prey item, there's probably going to be some issues for everyone involved. So we looked at diet importance, and that combines all these different measures into a single metric. We also broke out the diets in terms of lakes with high Cisco populations and lakes with low or no Cisco populations. And for muskies, we saw that their diets were very broad. They consumed prey from 26 different prey groups, including frogs, birds, muskrats, crayfish, aquatic insects, and a wide variety of fish species. These are just a handful of the most important prey groups that we found. From left to right, we have bullheads, aquatic invertebrates, bass, northern pike, white suckers, sunfish, cisco, and yellow perch. Perch were the most important prey item across the board. Suckers and aquatic invertebrates were also consumed consistently. Cisco accounted for about 5% of the diet in lakes where they were present, or high in numbers, I should say. In lakes with low or no Cisco populations, important prey included those bullheads on the left, largemouth bass, northern pike, and sunfish. So we also did the same process with northern pike, walleye, and largemouth bass, and that allows us to calculate a level of diet overlap between the predator species. Diet overlap tended to be low or below the blue line in just about every category except for between pike, which is NOP on the x or the bottom axis, and walleye, which is WAE. And they had high diet overlap both in lakes with and without Cisco's. We also saw that generally speaking, diet overlap tended to be a little bit lower in lakes with high Cisco populations. But really, the big takeaway here is that regardless of Cisco presence, muskie had really low overlap with all three other predator species that we studied. And this tends to indicate that competition between the species is unlikely. Next, we wanted to look at if these predators were eating everyone else's favorite fish, or walleye. So we looked at how many walleye were found in the stomachs of these fish. The numbers under the fish species on the bottom there indicate how many of each species we sampled throughout the study. Like I mentioned before, muskies are low population densities and didn't occur in all of the study lakes. So there's quite a few less muskies that we sampled. That said, they also consumed quite a few less walleye than, say, northern pike or walleye. Interestingly enough, largemouth bass only consumed one walleye in this study, which was a little bit surprising to us, honestly. Overall, northern pike consumed the most walleye at 17, followed by walleye, who consumed 7. Muskies ate 3 walleye, and overall, that was less than 1% of the total prey items collected from each predator. So that tells us that walleye are probably not an important food source for other fish in the lakes that we studied. Finally, we looked at size relationships between muskie, their length is on the bottom, and their prey on the left. Throughout the range of muskie sizes, we saw that they ate a wide range of prey sizes. Most of the prey was less than a third of the muskie's total length, which is that dashed line there. And that's kind of the accepted value in a lot of scientific studies of about the size range that most predators will eat. That said, certain individuals consumed prey that were 50% or bigger of their own length. So just to put that in perspective, if that's a 50-inch muskie, that's a muskie that's eating something 25 inches or more. And while prey size generally did increase with predator size, there was also lots of variability within predator sizes. So just as an example here, this green box indicates all of the muskie that we collected that were 48 inches or longer in total length. And as you can see here, their prey the length of prey that they consumed was still split pretty evenly between large and small prey fish. So with this portion of the diet or of the study, what did we learn? What are the takeaways? Muskie diets were very broad and included prey known to be important to muskies from previous research, including yellow perch and white sucker, and a few surprises as well, like aquatic invertebrates and bullheads. All three of the other species tended to have more specialized diets, and that led to low levels of diet overlap with muskies. Ciscos were generally not important across lakes. As you remember, just about 5% of the total muskie diet. But in certain lakes, we did see an increased importance in fall. Walleye were rare in diets across species. Again, I just want to really get this point across. So there's only one walleye consumed by largemouth bass. The number worked out to about one walleye per 109 muskies that we sampled, one walleye per 125 walleye that we sampled, and one walleye per 44 northern pike. So northern pike were about a little over twice as likely to consume walleye as muskies were. And muskie prey ranged in size regardless of how big the muskie was. But with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian, and he's going to talk about stable isotopes a little bit.
Thanks, Kamden. Next, I'm going to talk about our second research approach, which involves using stable isotopes to investigate the trophic ecology and ecology in general of muskies and other fish in Minnesota lakes. Like with Kamden's stuff, this was a huge research effort. We collected a little over 4,300 samples for this research component. So how do you pull this off? The approach my main collaborator and I, Kyle Zimmer, and I often use is to hire a bunch of young, motivated college students. We had 7 of them over the past 4 years, pictured here, each working on their own independent research project. I don't have time to get into it, and we're focused on muskie here today, but the words I put up here reflect some of their research topics. The species the students worked on varied, but included walleye and northern pike, cisco, yellow perch, and some focused on whole fish communities. They left the muskie all to me, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next few slides. So what are stable isotopes? They're different forms of the same elements, such as carbon and nitrogen, that occur naturally on Earth, but have slightly different weights. These ratios record fundamental processes in ecology, and they have many different applications. The key property, though, that we're taking advantage of in the research I'm presenting today, though, is that you are what you eat when it comes to isotopes. Animals reflect the isotope signatures of their food. So as for the how, we collect a small piece of muscle tissue from both the predators and their prey using a small biopsy tool, which Mary Thielen is shown using in the upper right photo. And we analyze those samples for carbon and nitrogen stable isotope ratios. With this kind of data, we can then understand an animal's dietary history. These isotope signatures are integrated over months when it comes to fish's diet. We can determine if a fish derives its energy from nearshore or open water food sources. That can tell you something about the nature and ecology of fish as well. And one of the very specific uses of isotopes in our research is to determine whether muskie eats cisco. This is important because we're unable to sample those muskies and examine their stomach contents when they're feeding offshore. The methods Kamden used and talked about really work best near shore. And for that reason, may have a little bit of a bias when it comes to detecting cisco in diets, because cisco are species that live offshore and eat zooplankton. I'm going to be showing you a couple graphs like this, and the notation goes like this. The y-axis is labeled del, that's the funny looking D, N15, and that's simply the ratio of N15 to N14. And the x-axis is labeled del carbon 13, and that's the ratio of carbon 13 to carbon 12. Now for the rules, our bodies and fish's bodies can exchange the lighter isotope a little easier as we process the carbon that we eat and as our bodies get rid of nitrogenous waste. So animals, us, fish, all animals end up a little bit heavier than their food. For nitrogen, that goes up by about 3.4 units, N15 units. And for the carbon, that ratio goes up just a little bit, 0.1 carbon 13 units. So the black arrow here depicts that overall change if a muskie is eating just cisco. The best way to illustrate how we're using isotopes today, though, is with an example using real data from Lake Bemidji. Here you can see the mean value for cisco on the upper left-hand side of the graph. Again, that's an offshore fish that eats zooplankton and tends to have a really unique signature, carbon and nitrogen signature. Littoral invertebrates are in the bottom right, and prey fish like yellow perch and white sucker are in between. So in hypothetical number 1, this is where the muskie signature would end up if they're eating just Cisco. In hypothetical number 2, this is where the muskies would end up if they're eating just prey fish. And finally, if they're eating just littoral invertebrates, here's where the muskie signature would end up. This, however, is the actual stable isotope signature of muskies in Lake Bemidji. So what this means is that muskie are eating some mix of all 3 of these food sources. And those proportions can be estimated with statistics. Those are the results I'm going to show you in the next couple graphs, minus the detailed math to get there. So here are the results for muskies in the lakes without Cisco. On the y-axis is the estimated proportion of the diet represented by the prey items on the bottom of the graph. So for bald eagle, that's littoral invertebrates, prey fish, and yellow bullhead. So in Bald Eagle Lake, spring caught muskie had a strong isotope signal indicating that bullheads were about 90% of their diet. Other prey fish and littoral invertebrates rounded out the rest of the muskie diets in that lake. In Chaminade, a 2-prey model was best statistically, with prey fish dominating their diet at nearly 100%. In the lakes with Cisco, there were 2 main patterns in Miltona and Pelican, which are known to have small Cisco populations present. Prey fish other than Cisco were the most important component of muskie diets at about 80 to 85%. Littoral invertebrates and Cisco rounded out the muskie diets in those lakes. The second pattern, which we saw in Bemidji and Elk Lakes, which both have higher numbers of Cisco present in the lake, was that about half of the diet of spring caught muskie were contributed by Cisco. So this probably reflects the muskie feeding considerably on this prey in late summer through fall. Now we don't have stomach content information for Elk Lake, but in Bemidji, we didn't detect any Cisco and muskie diets until our fall sampling season, when Cisco were about 22% of the muskie diets. So it seems we might be underestimating Cisco by about 50% or so in Bemidji. We have 3 more lakes to look at this with good Cisco numbers, Cass, North Star, and Little Boy lakes to see if this pattern of Cisco importance holds. Interestingly, and as a final point, invertebrates were almost 30% of the muskie diets in Lake Bemidji, and Kamden also observed that in his spring and summer muskie diets on this lake. So it's nice to see this agreement using the 2 different methods. Okay, switching gears, in our third approach to understand the role of muskie in lakes, my main collaborator on this, Tyler Ahrensdorf, and I are using bioenergetics models to compare the consumption of muskie and other predator fish in 3 different Minnesota lakes. Kamden's data, which is reflected in these photos on the bottom, is an input into these models, so it's nice to be able to recycle his data for this additional research. So what is bioenergetics? Basically, it's a fish physiology model that allows us to track energy into and through an individual fish. What this means then is that we can answer the question, how much of each prey species do predators consume? Lab studies for these kind of models have been conducted previously where folks figure out the various physiological parameters, things like respiration, consumption rates, things like that. So for us to apply these models, the main data requirements are field things. We need to collect diet information, water temperatures, fish growth, and we need to know how many fish are in the lake. Armed with this data, we can then ask practical questions like, do muskies really eat all the food in the lake? Do they eat all the walleye? Collecting the needed data is a pretty big lift, so we were only able to do 1 case study lake each year. We worked on Chaminade Lake in 2021. Last year, we worked up on North Star Lake, and this year we're working on Bald Eagle Lake in the North Metro. So the first step in this bioenergetics process is estimating consumption by an individual, which is the amount of energy that needs to come into that fish's mouth here in the diagram to balance its respiration losses, cost of breaking down food for use in storage, that's specific dynamic action in this model, and losses associated with eliminating waste, so that's EG and EX in this diagram. Fish are cold-blooded, so all the stuff in orange, all the arrows and rates generally increase with temperature. So for data inputs, we obviously need water temperature. We get that from temperature loggers that we deploy in the lake. We need to know diets. That's where Kamden's data comes in. And we need to know about fish growth. And we get that by aging fish to determine how fast they grow from one age to the next. The second step in this process is scaling up. So to answer the question, how much food is consumed by a population, we need to multiply the consumption by an individual fish by the number of fish in the lake. So the data inputs here are population estimates. These take weeks of work by multiple crews to mark and recapture fish. And we needed to do this for 4 different species in the studies: muskies, walleye, northern pike, largemouth bass. So it really is a lot of work and kind of 1 lake per year sort of thing. I'll come back to what those population estimate results were in just a bit here. But first, here are the results for consumption by individual fish of different ages on the x-axis for each of the 4 species in North Star Lake. In general, each species eats more food as they get older and larger, so as you move from left to right in these graphs. For adult largemouth bass in the upper left, their consumption doesn't change as much as they grow, slightly larger from 1 year to the next. But muskies, on the other hand, do grow really large, and so they need to eat a lot of food. For the oldest and largest female and male muskies in this lake, females eat about 48 pounds of food per year, and males eat about 33 pounds of food per year. In Chaminade Lake, similar patterns overall to North Star, and differences are driven by things like differences in water temperature and the types of prey that they're eating being different. For example, in North Star Lake, the predators eat energy-rich fatty cisco, so they don't need to eat as much food compared to Chaminade Lake. So here are those population estimates where we marked a whole bunch of fish in each lake, let them go, and then used the proportions of marked and unmarked fish in different time periods or over a period of time to estimate how many fish there are in the lake. So here's how that came out. In Chaminade, which is the blue bars, there's many more muskie and largemouth bass present than walleye and muskie in the lake. In both lakes, muskies are in the low hundreds in terms of total numbers, whereas the other species are in the thousands. In North Star, so that's the orange bars, you can see that largemouth bass and northern pike are quite a bit less abundant than they were in Chaminade. But the walleye, though, they were quite similar between the 2 lakes. Anyway, these are the numbers we use to scale up to get the population level consumption. And here's what we get for population level consumption when we do that, starting with North Star Lake. The northern pike population ate the most, about 9,000 kilograms or almost 20,000 pounds of food per year. And that's about 50% or well over 50% of the food comparing across the 4 predator species, and about 3 times the amount of food eaten by muskies. Walleye, largemouth bass, and muskie all ate similar amounts, and North Star between 6,000 to 7,000 pounds of food each. In Chaminade, again, northern pike ate the most, and muskie ate the least, with the walleye and largemouth bass falling in between. The other thing we can look at is how much of each prey species is consumed. So starting with muskie and North Star Lake, they eat a lot of cisco and northern pike and sort of a wide range of other stuff. And in Chaminade, bullheads were the most heavily consumed prey, and again, muskie ate a wide range of other prey. Next, now adding in largemouth bass, you can see how they're heavily focused on and eat a lot of crayfish. Finally, adding in the walleye and northern pike, much more overlap in what they're eating. They're focused on yellow perch and cisco in North Star Lake, and focused in on yellow perch and sunfish more so in Chaminade Lake. Overall, if you look at the yellow bars compared to the gray bars, I think you can see muskie tend to eat different prey in these lakes. They seem to be sharing the most. The thing they seem to be sharing the most would be cisco and North Star Lake. Walleye and northern pike also like to eat cisco. So in summary, bioenergetics is a nice tool because it allows a deeper look into competition between these predators. In the bioenergetics case study lakes, North Star and Chaminade, northern pike ate the most food in both of those lakes. Muskie populations can eat a lot of food, we found, despite their low numbers. That's because they're large fish and need to eat a lot. But because muskie densities are low, overall, they end up eating a similar amount of food as the largemouth bass or walleye population in North Star Lake. And in Chaminade Lake, where muskie numbers are quite a bit lower, they eat much less food than the walleye or largemouth bass population. One of the other key things is that muskies seem to consume different and more diverse prey resources than the other predators. And this is something that really helps to reduce potential competition with walleye, bass, and northern pike. One more case study lake coming where we'll have this kind of data. We're currently working on Bald Eagle Lake, and we're literally wrapping up population estimates this week and next. In fact, Will French and one of our new students are going out electrofishing tonight. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Jim to share with you the gear, techniques, and tips for how to catch these muskies.
Thanks, Brian. good information, both as a DNR fisheries manager for the past 34 years, and also as an angler. I like to fish muskies, and I always find diet information very helpful when I'm preparing to go to maybe a new lake or fishing a lake that I have fished in the past. So the last part of this presentation, I'm just going to talk about some angling gear. If you're new to muskie fishing, if it's something you think you want to try, we'll talk about some gear that you need, and then we'll also talk about some methods, a little bit about location, where to find muskies throughout the year, and then, you know, how do we use this information that Kamden and Brian presented to help us, you know, put some odds in our favor to land a muskie. You can go next, Brian. Oops. You're on mute.
Is it not showing, Jim?
No, I can hear it. Do I have control?
Nope, on my computer it shows lure types. I'm not sure what happened here.
Oh, on mine it is still the first slide.
How about now?
No, I got it. There you go.
Okay.
Okay, so lure types. Basically, for any kind of lure that you're going to use, you're going to rely on some of the things that muskies detect forage. Sight being a very important one for muskie. The vibration component, which they use the lateral line to pick up those vibrations. Scent, certain times of the year, scent comes into play. And then also the size of the lure or the prey item is going to dictate, you know, how aggressive a muskie may react to a lure. So I have kind of the top 6 baits I would consider, the basic baits that cover a wide variety of those muskie lures that are out there. The first one being a topwater bait. This basically, that's in the upper left-hand corner. This basically is a bait that gets cast out, and then as it's coming in, the propellers or the blades on it create a splashing noise, and that surface kind of commotion actually gets the attention of muskies. Topwater lures are very effective during certain times of the year, and topwater lures are very easy to use. The crankbait to the right, that can be used at various depths and various sizes. Again, musky lures generally from 5 to 10 inches are probably the common size of lures to use if you're after muskies. So the body shape can vary according to manufacturers. The lip size, the shape, and the angle of the lip will dictate how deep a crankbait will go. The jerk bait or the dive and rise bait is basically that. It's a lure that you cast out, a fairly shallow running bait. You would pull on your rod, the bait goes down, and then when you let up on it, the bait will actually go up or stay right there. And then so as you're doing this, usually those pauses are when you're going to get a muskie to hit. The straight shaft spinner and the spinner bait to the right, bottom two different types of spinners. Both rely on visual and vibration to attract muskies. Pretty straightforward to use. The straight shafted spinnerbait in the middle there, generally a shallow water presentation type of lure. The spinnerbait below that one can be used at deeper depths. If you let that bait fall, that end blade will actually kind of helicopter on its way down, and sometimes that can be beneficial to catch a muskie. The last one there to the bottom right are the rubber or soft plastic types of baits. These are generally pretty heavy baits, large profile baits, depending on the tail. This happens to be a paddle tail lure. There's also round corkscrew style tails that can go on them. They give off, again, a big profile for sight and then some vibration. So color patterns in Kamden's and Brian's previous information, you found that muskies are very opportunistic, eat a wide variety of things. And again, this can vary by lake, but here's some examples of some manufacturer color options that they have for their lures. So you can see on there that they cover everything from rough fish. You can see the brown lures there probably represent suckers or carp, maybe a brown perch color pattern. Game fish, you can see there's actually a northern pike, the second one from the upper left. That's a northern pike pattern. There's a rainbow trout pattern in there, yellow perch pattern. Open water fish, a lot of lighter color lures, white, silver, some holographic colors that would imitate the cisco or the whitefish that muskies may eat out in open water. And then interesting enough, mammals, some rodent type lures, mice, muskrat type lures are out there. Waterfowl, Kamden mentioned that these food items don't make up a majority of the muskies' diets, but from a fishing standpoint, it's something different. It's something that may get a muskie to strike when something else that they've seen quite a bit of won't. There's even some snake lures that are out there, and then of course the frogs, larger versions of topwater frogs. So this is actually, I put this in here as an example. Way before this study, this was a fish that was illegally speared in Otter Tail County back in 2015. So way before we started this study. And this fish happened to be confiscated by law enforcement, our conservation officers. And I was able to get a hand on that fish because number one, I wanted to find out how old it was. And then number two, see what was in the stomach. So you can see that the spear marks on the back, but much to my amazement at that time, when we cut it open, there was an 8-inch bullhead in its stomach. So this happened to be from Pelican Lake, which happens to be in Brian's study. So interesting that it's a lake that relies on forage fish, has ciscos, but also has bullheads, but in lesser numbers. But here's a prime example of what a fish is eating. Did it prefer to eat that bullhead? Maybe not, but it's something that it took advantage of an opportunity to eat that 8-inch bullhead. Leader types. So you're going to want some protection on the end of your lure for the toothy predator. So leaders come basically in 3 different types. They come in a solid wire version on the very top. They come in a wire stranded version, which is a little more flexible. And then you can also get a fluorocarbon leader that fluorocarbon is a little more resistant to nicks and cuts than monofilament. And so it does provide a better leader material, and yet pretty much is invisible in water. So a good leader will have a ball bearing swivel and then different attachments, styles on how to hook your lure to it. Rod and reel types. Again, if you're new to muskie fishing, basically the bait cast reel is the go-to setup. The rod is pretty stiff. The reel is located on top. Again, it's commonly used for muskie fishing, primarily I think because it's able to handle those large, heavy lures that we talked about, versus the spinning reel and the spinning rod. Although I think if we were able to get more saltwater type of fishing equipment here in Minnesota, the spinning reel, rod and reel, I think would be a good option. I think it's underutilized for muskie fishing. Rod lengths, generally 7 to 9 foot rod length. Seems long, but again, it allows you to handle those large lures. You want a rod that is stiff. in that 7 to 9 foot, and then it has a fast tip. So to the right of that, you can see here's a rod manufacturer. The specifications for any rod will be listed on the rod right above the reel seat. And in this case, this is a 9-foot rod, heavy action, fast tip, rated for 50 to 80 pound braid, and 2 to 8 ounce lures. So it's a rod that will be able to handle those larger lures. Release tools are very important. When you catch a muskie, it's important to try to minimize the handling of that fish, get the hooks out and get it back into the water as soon as you can. So the release tools are really for safety for you and the fish. Okay, these are a picture of my tools that I use. I have them laying out in the boat, all ready to go when I begin a muskie fishing trip. So they're right there. A side cutter and a bolt cutter are great for cutting hooks. If a hook is deep to where you think trying to pull it out is going to cause a lot of damage, cut the hook. Hooks are fairly cheap, maybe 50 cents for a replacement treble hook. If you cut that hook, it's less time working on the fish. It's safer for you not working around the muskie's teeth. And so cutting a hook is definitely a viable option. 90-degree pliers and the straight nose pliers. That's a 12-inch straight nose pliers to reach down to get some hooks out. The 90-degree pliers gives you a little bit better sight looking down into the stomach. And then a heavy-duty jaw spreader. And Kamden had one of these showing on his video showing the gastric lavage. It keeps the mouth open so that you're able to work on the fish and get the hooks out as quick as you can. And again, if you do cut hooks, you want to make sure that you get all the pieces out of the fish. You don't want to leave a piece of the treble hook or the single hook in the fish that may cause some damage later on. So for handling muskies, a large rubber coated net is probably the best thing to have. This allows the fish to be netted without flipping and flopping out. You don't want to lose that fish that you just spent a lot of time catching. So the larger, the better. Rubber coated actually is easier on the fish on its slime coat for after you release the muskie. A measuring board or measuring tape because you want to know how long that fish is. And so that's something you want to have. Rubber gloves to protect both you and the fish. Anytime you're working around the muskie's mouth, if you have a rubber glove, that's going to potentially protect you from getting sliced open. And then proper hand placement for lifting fish from the net. There's a lot of information out there on the internet on how to handle muskies. The correct placement is to run your gloved hand right directly under the gill plate, between the gill plate and the first gill raker, and then slide it up towards the mouth, and then pinch with your index finger and your thumb against the muskie, and then lift the fish out and support the bottom part of the fish. And that's for lifting it out, pictures, whatever, returning it to the water. That's the best practice. Lure retrieves, again, just going over quickly the different lure types. Top water, straight retrieve. This is the easiest lure to use for a beginner. It doesn't sink if you happen to get a backlash on your reel. Won't sink to the bottom and get snagged. Crankbait, straight retrieve, or the pause retrieve. The jerk bait, sweep and pause. Straight shafts, spinner, and the spinner bait. Your straight retrieves are needed on those. When you stop the lure, the blades won't spin, and a muskie will lose interest if it's following. So rubber baits, straight retrieve, or a pause, let the lure sink a little bit, and then jerk it, and then let it sink again. Kind of a erratic retrieve is is a good option there. Fishing methods. So casting, generally done in a boat, usually stand because you are using heavier lures. Generally speaking, one person in the front, one in the back, get as far away from each other as possible to prevent any snagging or catching objects or other people. This is used to pick out and cover precise structure like a weed island. You would stay out deep and go around the whole island slowly and use precise casts to try to pick out a fish that is in that structure. Trolling is a great way, forward motion with the outboard motor. It's a great way to cover water quickly, looking for aggressive fish. Also a good way to learn a new lake if you're on a new lake. Troll around for a while to get to know that lake, find out where the weed beds are. Speeds can be from anywhere from 3 to 5 miles per hour. It sounds like you're going fast, you are going fast, but again, you're trying to basically have a reaction strike from that muskie. And then rod holders are generally used just because these are bigger baits, you're going fast, there's a lot of pressure to hold a rod. Shore fishing or pier fishing, generally cast, or you can use live bait. Still fishing, very popular in the fall off of piers and shore to use live sucker minnows. Again, you're limited by where that pier is placed for fishing for muskies, but muskies do roam, and so there are a number of fish that are caught off of piers and shore fishing in the state. The figure 8 boatside technique is something that you may hear about from muskie anglers. It's basically a figure 8 move, or sometimes an oval shape works to do also. It's basically trying to extend your cast with the lure in motion. A lot of times muskies will eat a lure as the lure change directions. So this figure 8 is commonly used by anglers, especially when they see a follow, but sometimes in dirty water, it's used after each cast. So again, the muskies usually bite on the curve or the change of direction and the speed of the lure. So if you do this, expect, and you have a muskie following, just kind of anticipate that a muskie will bite on the curve or the speed change. Locations, a couple different diagrams here. Points projecting from shore, humps or sunken islands, sharp breaks, down trees, emergent plant beds. These are all areas that are going to have muskies present. And they'll be even better if there's bait fish that are present on these types of structures. So if you can follow bait fish, you'll tend to follow not only muskies, but walleyes and bass. Other predator fish follow the bait fish. And depending on the kind of year will dictate, or the time of the year will dictate where these bait fish and the prey fish will be hanging out. But these are all good areas to check if you're going after muskie. Weed beds, probably the number one habitat out there for muskies is weed beds, and cabbage, what they call cabbage, is the best, I think, the best aquatic plant out there that provides muskie some of the foraging, ambush feeding type of habitat that they use. So green cabbage beds, you'll hear that term from muskie anglers. So it is something to keep in mind and look for. Areas of rock, gravel, boulder transitions. Anytime you have a transition area, there likely is going to be bait fish there and prey items. And those are going to also be other areas that are going to attract muskies and other fish as well. So in summary then, just some tips. Patience is required for muskie fishing. Kamden and Brian mentioned this is a low density, top level predator. basically is opportunistic. It can eat anything out there it wants to, but it chooses to eat a wide variety of stuff. So patience is required. They eat, again, they eat a wide variety of food. So that's why manufacturers have all kinds of different types and colors of lures out there, is to try to give you an option to throw something different at a muskie. A tip that I'd like to give is to fish with an experienced muskie angler if it's your first time, and if you have the option to, anytime that you can. You're going to learn a lot from people that have fished for them. If it's your first time, they have all the gear, and a lot of muskie anglers that I know are willing to take people out and introduce them to the sport. So it's something you can try. If you don't like it, fine, you haven't put a lot of money into it. If you do like it, you can build from there. And then also check out how to fish for muskies. Do some searching on the various internet sites to kind of tune your skills. Again, there's a lot of information out there on how to catch muskies. So thank you.
Great job, guys. Lots of information there. So we'll see if we have any good questions come in. I did open a couple polling questions. So if everybody wants to open up the polling, again, it's the bottom right-hand corner down there in the 3 ellipsis. You can open those up and answer the polling questions just kind of for fun. Appreciate that. And Brian, when you get a chance, you can pop the screen down there. And I'll look and see if we got any questions coming. It doesn't look like we have much for questions. You guys must have covered everything so good. I know we're running a little short on time here, so we'll see what the polling questions come back as. We had almost half the people that have answered have never caught a muskie. And only a few of them are planning to head out this weekend for the muskie opener. So, and a lot of them learned something about muskie today, so that's always good. That's what we're here for, right? So, any other tips or tricks or advice you'd think for this weekend, being it's going to be a fairly warm weekend? Are you going to target shallower or deeper?
So for me, you know, the water temperatures are going up fast. You know, think about it. Just a couple 3 weeks ago, we were doing muskie spawning assessments, and so I think the muskies this weekend are going to be more into mid to late June pattern. So I think we're going to be a couple weeks ahead of where they normally would be. So yeah, the fish will be in the shallows. Females still might be kind of suspended out from the shallow weedy structure. So trolling might be a good option. At least you know, look out there. Don't just concentrate on the shallow weed lines and things like that. Would be my recommendation. That's what I'm going to do.
I'll just throw in real quick. We were doing a panfish survey on Lake Vermilion last week, and we were still seeing paired up muskies in a few of our panfish trap nets. So some of the larger lakes and way up north, especially if you're heading up north this weekend, don't be afraid to check out some of the shallow spawning bays or maybe those first transition areas out of those spawning bays, because those fish should just be coming off the spawn.
Great ideas. Steve had an interesting question he just put in here. To calculate the pounds of a muskie, you need the length and the girth. Is the girth taken right behind the gills?
So the girth is taken, yep, behind the gills and actually behind the pectoral fins. The fins right underneath the gills. Yeah, or basically the the thickest part. In the fall, you'll see that the actual stomach area might be even bigger than closer to the head. So people will girth them on that main stomach area too.
Okay, great.
Again, you want to try to give it the best opportunity, not only length but with the girth. You want to try to find that thickest point.
So aim for the thickest point. Good idea. Jeff asked a question. If you had to choose one lake to catch your first muskie, what would your go-to lake be?
I guess I'll throw one lake out, and it's not even a lake that I've fished personally, but I've heard enough rumors about it now already. Dumbbell Lake up by Isabella is one of the lakes that was originally stocked with the shoepack strain. So the fish aren't very big, but I've heard that there's a tremendous number of fish in there. So if you're looking to just catch your first one, that might not be a bad place to start.
Road trip to Isabella this weekend. All right.
And we have, when I get that question in my area, Otter Tail County, West Central Minnesota, I usually recommend Beers Lake and Maplewood State Park. It's a 200-acre lake. We did a muskie assessment on that one this spring, so it has a fairly high number of muskies in it, for muskie density. So it's a good lake that you'll see fish, and you have a good chance of catching a muskie up there also.
Great. And Jason was asking, I think you alluded to it a little bit, but muskie hunt more by sight than smell. Is that correct?
Sorry. Yeah, so kind of like pike, muskies and pike are in the same family, and they're ambush predators, and so they do rely on sight. And so the water clarity is a big thing. If the water is a little bit more stained, then maybe the vibration, the top waters, the bigger bladed bucktails, the bigger tail padded tail lures would provide more vibration in the dirtier, more productive waters. But yeah, sight is a big part of it.
And William mentioned that there's a rearing pond up at Clearwater Lake, Beltrami County. He was wondering how many muskies are obtained from this pond and how many do you stock in each lake when you stock muskies? Is it a Brian question?
Yeah, I think the number we get out, varies a lot from year to year, but it can be to like 1,000 fish or something like that, and they get allocated to our different stocked muskie lakes in the Bemidji area.
Great. Looking in the chat here, we're just about out of time, so I think we got most of the questions covered. There's asking about research up in Lake of the Woods or Rainy River Basin. Are you guys planning on doing any research up there on muskies in the future?
We don't have anything currently planned, but there's been talk of maybe doing some more muskie research up at Vermilion Lake at some point, using some of these methods up there. We haven't been approached about Lake of the Woods yet, so.
Oh yeah, great. I think with that, if you guys do have any other questions, reach out to us and we can forward them on to Jim, Brian, or Kamden. Thank you guys for joining us today. It was a great presentation with a lot of information. Learn something new about muskies, so that's always the goal. I think with that, we're going to stop the recording. Wish everybody a happy and safe weekend out there today. Remember, our registration for our summer programs is open. Summer programs, we're going to start with boating on the 7th of June. So it should be a good program. Get on there, register for those programs so you get a link to them, and we'll see you next week, hopefully. Thanks, everyone.